Night has fallen over the jungle. The sound of rain mingles with the faint hum of insects and distant waves hitting the coral shore. In the darkness, Japanese soldiers crouch beside empty crates waiting for supplies that never come. Their rice is gone, their ammunition nearly spent. The jungle smells of sweat, mildew, and slow decay. A few men whisper prayers. Others stare blankly toward the black horizon where the Tokyo Express was supposed to appear hours ago. Across the same ocean, a different scene unfolds. Floodlights blaze over a convoy of American transport ships unloading cargo. Fuel drums, crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and canned food by the ton. Forklifts home. Navy engineers work through the night under arcs of light, refueling tanks and aircraft that will launch again at dawn. Two worlds divided by the same sea, one starving, one thriving. At Guadalcanal, Japan begins to understand that this war will not be decided by courage alone, but by the invisible power of supply. In the first months of the Pacific War, the Empire of Japan seemed unstoppable. From the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to the fall of Singapore and the Philippines in early 1942, Japanese forces advanced with breathtaking speed. Their soldiers fought with precision and fierce devotion, guided by the Bushido Code, the belief that spiritual strength could overcome material weakness. Everywhere the same pattern repeated. Swift landings, rapid assaults, and enemy forces collapsing before they could organize. British troops in Malaya, Dutch soldiers in the East Indies, American units scattered across the Philippines. All fell within months. The rising sun flag fluttered over territories stretching thousands of miles. Tokyo celebrated. The press called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. For Japan's high command, these victories confirmed a conviction deeply rooted in its military culture. That Western armies were soft, dependent on machines, and lacking spirit. The Japanese soldier, trained to endure hunger, exhaustion, and pain, was seen as the ultimate warrior, superior through willpower and sacrifice. Logistics, in their eyes, belonged to the realm of industrial weakness. To fight with what one carried on his back was noble. To depend on endless supplies was not. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, had warned his superiors about this arrogance. He knew America's industrial capacity firsthand. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. "I can run wild for 6 months," he had once written, "but after that I have no expectation of success." His warning went largely ignored. The victories of early 1942 seemed to prove that Japan's destiny was unshakable. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States was still reeling. The battleships of Pearl Harbor lay in twisted ruin. The Philippines, under General Douglas MacArthur, were collapsing. The morale of the American public hung on a knife's edge. Yet beneath the surface of shock and grief, something immense was beginning to move. Factories that once built automobiles began producing tanks and planes. Shipyards along the West Coast worked in relentless rhythm, hammering steel day and night. Millions of men and women entered the war industry. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy was not just a slogan, it was a mobilization without precedent in human history. But in early 1942, none of that was visible on the battlefield. Japanese forces mocked American logistics as slow, clumsy, and overdependent on machines. Propaganda leaflets described U.S. soldiers as pampered children of industry, incapable of fighting without canned food and cigarettes. To the Japanese command, this was a war of spirit, and spirit was something America could not mass-produce. They did not yet see the storm forming across the ocean, the quiet machinery of a nation preparing for a war of endurance. And as Japanese forces pushed deeper into the Pacific, their own logistical foundations began to strain. Long supply lines stretched across vast waters. Merchant ships grew scarce. Every new island captured required food, ammunition, and fuel that had to travel thousands of miles under threat of American submarines. Still, the illusion of invincibility persisted. Tokyo believed it had time to fortify, to negotiate, or to force the United States into peace through exhaustion. But time was precisely what America intended to deny them. By the summer of 1942, American shipyards were launching new vessels faster than Japan could sink them. A single U.S. shipyard could build more in a month than Japan could in a year. The war was shifting from one of daring assaults to one of production, a type of war Japan was not prepared to fight. The moment of truth would come soon on a small, humid island in the Solomon Chain. a place few had heard of before. It was called Guadalcanal, and there, for the first time, Japan's warriors would face not only American soldiers but the full reach of American logistics. When the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, America faced a simple truth. It could not outfight Japan with what it had. It had to outproduce it. Factories that had fallen silent during the Great Depression roared back to life. Automobile plants in Detroit stopped making cars and began building tanks, jeeps, and bombers. Shipyards on both coasts became cities of steel and flame, launching Liberty ships at a pace the world had never seen, sometimes one every 4 days. Behind the front lines, a new kind of warfare emerged: logistical warfare. It was a war fought not only by soldiers but by engineers, welders, railroad workers, and factory women. Every rivet and every steel plate was a bullet in a new kind of arsenal. In 1942, the War Production Board coordinated every ounce of material: copper, rubber, oil, and food. Trains carried supplies across the continent to ports in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle, where they were loaded onto convoys bound for the Pacific. The scale was staggering. By late 1942, over 8 million tons of war cargo had been shipped across the ocean, an invisible arm stretching from American factories to the farthest islands. But logistics was not just about quantity, it was about innovation. Engineers in Washington and Hawaii began designing a supply chain that could move with the front. Every island captured would become a new forward base, a living organism of airfields, fuel depots, and hospitals. The U.S. Navy called it mobile logistics, and it would become the backbone of the island-hopping strategy. To make it possible, an extraordinary force was created, the Seabees, short for construction battalions. They were builders and fighters both, men who could storm a beach under fire, clear the jungle, and lay down an airstrip within days. Wherever Marines landed, the Seabees followed. They built docks, warehouses, fuel pipelines, and repair stations, transforming barren islands into operational fortresses. Meanwhile, in the skies above, a quiet revolution was taking shape in coordination and communication. Radar networks, cargo scheduling systems, and convoy escorts ensured that supplies flowed without pause. The Pacific became an industrial highway. Each operation, Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, was not just a naval battle. It was a logistical experiment. And with each month, the Americans learned faster. They built faster. They supplied faster. Japan's intelligence officers began to notice the change. Reports from occupied territories mentioned an alarming pattern. The Americans do not retreat. They build. Where Japan saw isolated islands, America saw stepping stones, a connected chain reaching toward Tokyo itself. By mid-1942, the difference between the two empires was not only military but structural. Japan was an empire stretched thin, with limited resources, few shipyards, and a shrinking merchant fleet constantly hunted by submarines. America, by contrast, had become a self-sustaining engine of war. Every week, new Liberty ships departed San Francisco Bay. Convoys of oil tankers and cargo carriers stretched beyond the horizon. The Pacific, once Japan's domain, was beginning to belong to industry. And yet the ultimate test had not come. Blueprints and promises meant little until they faced the brutality of real combat. The United States would soon have to prove whether its mountains of material could survive the storms of battle, disease, and distance. That test would come at Guadalcanal, a place where the line between victory and starvation would depend entirely on supply. Here in the jungles and swamps of the Solomon Islands, America's industrial awakening would meet Japan's faith and endurance. One side would fight for honor, the other in for logistics. On Guadalcanal, the jungle was as much an enemy as the soldiers themselves. Thick vines, heat, disease, and mud swallowed men whole. The island was alive and with insects, rot, and fear. In such a place, supply was not a luxury. It was life itself. For the Japanese soldier, that life was slipping away. By late 1942, food rations had run out. Supplies meant for the front never arrived. The Tokyo Express and destroyers rushing at night to deliver crates of ammunition and rice often returned half empty, their decks riddled by American air raids. What little reached the shore was carried through swamps and ridges by starving men. Some boiled leather from their belts, others hunted rats or stripped palm trees for nourishment. Their diaries tell the same story, of men who still believed in the emperor's cause but whose bodies could no longer obey. One entry from a Japanese infantryman reads, "We eat grass and roots. The enemy fires every day, but hunger is worse than shells." Across the same jungle, American Marines faced their own horrors: malaria, snipers, and exhaustion. Yet their lines never broke. The difference was invisible but decisive: logistics. Every day, American transports unloaded tons of supplies at the newly secured beachheads. Canned food, fuel drums, ammunition crates, even mail from home. At dawn, Navy engineers laid temporary roads. Trucks carried supplies inland under the constant threat of air attack. Pilots from Henderson Field guarded the skies, ensuring the lifeline stayed open. To the Japanese, it seemed impossible. How could an army so far from its homeland continue to fight with such abundance? The answer was not luck. It was planning. American officers had begun to treat logistics as the foundation of strategy, not the afterthought. For General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the Marines on Guadalcanal, success meant not only holding ground but keeping men fed, fueled, and supplied. Every bullet fired was tracked, every ration accounted for. Engineers mapped out supply routes in advance of assaults. Ships were loaded with mathematical precision, first ashore, last aboard. In contrast, Japanese command saw logistics as the servant of battle, not its master. Their tactical doctrine emphasized surprise, offense, and endurance, a style of warfare suited for short campaigns, not long occupations. The Imperial Army had no dedicated logistics corps, and supply planning often ended the moment a landing succeeded. Once on land, units were expected to live off what they could find. But Guadalcanal was not China or Burma. It offered nothing. No farms, no villages, only swamp and jungle. Japan's doctrine met the limits of geography. As the campaign dragged on, the contrast grew unbearable. American troops received letters, hot meals, and reinforcements. Japanese soldiers received silence. When night fell, Marines could see the glow of U.S. supply ships offshore, hundreds of lights burning through the dark Pacific. On the other side, Japanese soldiers whispered to each other about the enemy's endless ships, calling them ghost factories that produced without end. The tactical outcome was inevitable. Hungry men cannot fight effectively, and starving units cannot hold ground. Japan's command sent orders for last-ditch attacks, banzai charges meant to break the stalemate. But these were not acts of strategy. They were acts of despair. Each failed assault consumed the last of their strength. American officers began to recognize a pattern. Every time the Japanese attacked, they weakened. Every time the Americans held, they grew stronger. It was logistics turned into strategy, a war of endurance that Japan could not sustain. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, courage was everywhere, but victory belonged to those who could feed their courage. And as the island descended into months of attrition, the same truth was echoing through the Pacific, from the Coral Sea to Papua New Guinea. The side that controlled supply controlled destiny. The human experience of that realization was brutal, but the lessons it revealed would reshape how every modern army thought about war. The next layer of this story unfolds not in the trenches but in the shipyards and factories behind them, where technology and industry transformed logistics into an unstoppable force. War in the Pacific was not just fought with rifles and ships. It was fought with cranes, engines, and blueprints. The technology of supply, the ability to move, repair, and refuel across thousands of miles of open water, became the silent weapon of the United States. At the heart of this weapon stood the Liberty ship. Plain, steel gray, and slow, it was the most important vessel of the war. Not a warship, but a lifeline. Built in American shipyards by the thousands, these ships carried everything: food, trucks, munitions, even prefabricated buildings. Henry J. Kaiser's yards on the West Coast could assemble one in less than 5 days. Each new launch was a message to Tokyo. No matter how many you sink, more will come. Japan's shipyards, by contrast, were small, scattered, and limited in resources. They could not replace losses quickly enough. By 1943, U.S. submarines had begun a relentless campaign against Japanese merchant vessels. Every freighter sunk meant an island cut off, a garrison starved. The Imperial Navy could not protect its supply lines, and the once proud empire began to fracture, not under fire, but from hunger. Technology was America's greatest ally. The U.S. Navy developed floating dry docks that could repair damaged ships without returning to the mainland, turning distant lagoons into mobile ports. Oilers refueled entire fleets at sea. a concept the Japanese Navy never mastered. This innovation allowed Admiral Nimitz's task forces to remain operational for months at a time, striking from one island to the next without pause. Then came the Seabees, the human engineers of momentum. They brought with them bulldozers, cement mixers, and a doctrine: build fast, build anywhere. When Marines captured a beach, the Seabees followed immediately, laying steel mats for airfields, erecting control towers, and constructing hospitals, often under fire. Within days, bombers and fighters would land, extending American reach another 500 miles toward Japan. It was construction as warfare, a new language of conquest built from logistics. Each base became a link in a vast supply chain stretching from California to Okinawa. The Pacific, once a void of isolation, became a living grid of transport and communication. Cargo aircraft, naval convoys, and signal stations moved in synchronized rhythm, a machine as complex and unstoppable as any weapon ever built. The Japanese military could only watch. Their logistical structure was rigid and outdated, designed for short, decisive campaigns, not the vast geography of the Pacific. Merchant shipping was limited, and coordination between the Army and Navy was notoriously poor. Even when supplies reached an island, communication failures often left them sitting unused in the wrong locations. Reports from Rabaul and Truk described warehouses full of ammunition, but frontline troops without a single bullet. Technology revealed not only material differences but philosophical ones. For Japan, war remained a matter of bravery and sacrifice. For America, it became a matter of engineering and coordination. One built monuments to courage, the other built systems. And systems endure. Radar and radio also transformed supply warfare. By 1943, U.S. convoys navigated the Pacific through radar networks and coded communication systems that tracked every vessel's position. Weather forecasting improved accuracy in operations, reducing losses from storms that once plagued naval logistics. The Pacific Ocean, so vast it had once been a barrier, was now charted, mapped, and mechanized. By late 1943, the logistical balance was irreversible. American bases spanned the ocean like stepping stones: Pearl Harbor, Espiritu Santo, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan. Each became a hub of warehouses, machine shops, and hospitals. The U.S. could now invade, sustain, and reinforce at will. Japan, meanwhile, could only retreat and ration. A Japanese naval officer later reflected after the war: "We did not lose to the American soldier. We lost to the American factory." That factory was now in full stride, feeding the advance, fueling fleets, and powering an empire of supply. Soon, these invisible machines of war would converge on the islands that defined the Pacific struggle, and the world would witness how logistics itself could win battles. The proving ground was already chosen. Guadalcanal would reveal the truth of this transformation, and the turning of the tide would begin. In August 1942, the sea around the Solomon Islands shimmered with heat and tension. At dawn on the 7th, the quiet horizon exploded. The first major American offensive of the Pacific War had begun, Operation Watchtower. Thousands of Marines landed on the northern shores of Guadalcanal, storming through waves and mangrove mud toward a half-finished Japanese airstrip. They expected fierce resistance but met only scattered fire. The enemy, caught off guard, retreated into the jungle. By nightfall, the Americans had captured the airfield, later named Henderson Field. But victory was fragile. The U.S. fleet, fearing Japanese counterattack, withdrew prematurely. Marines were left stranded with limited supplies, facing the unknown. For weeks, the island trembled under bombardment, air raids by day, naval shelling by night. The Japanese Navy, still dominant, struck from the sea with impunity. By late August, Guadalcanal had become an island of isolation. Every ton of supplies mattered. American troops dug in, rationing food and ammunition. Disease and exhaustion spread. The Japanese, meanwhile, prepared for the counteroffensive they believed would reclaim the island and restore their honor. Tokyo saw Guadalcanal not as a logistical battle, but as a test of spirit. Reinforcements were sent nightly through the Tokyo Express, destroyers racing down the slot, the narrow waters between islands, under cover of darkness. They brought soldiers and shells, but rarely food. Cargo holds meant for rice and medicine were filled with artillery shells and mortars instead. To the Japanese command, firepower mattered more than sustenance. The consequences were immediate. Japanese troops fought bravely, often to the last man, but hunger stalked them. Reports describe men collapsing mid-assault, their rifles slipping from trembling hands, entire battalions reduced to skeletons. Yet they continued to fight, driven by duty and desperation. For the Americans, survival depended on a different kind of bravery, the endurance to keep the supply line open. Convoys from Espiritu Santo and Noumea steamed through submarine-infested waters, delivering tons of food, fuel, and ammunition. Each trip was a race against time and enemy aircraft. The Navy's transport ships became as critical as any battleship. In the skies above, the newly established Cactus Air Force, a patchwork of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots, defended Henderson Field. They fought daily to prevent Japanese bombers from severing the supply chain. Every gallon of fuel and every spare part flown in meant another day of survival. By October, the campaign had become a test of endurance on both sides. Japanese forces launched massive assaults, each repelled with devastating losses. The Americans, bolstered by continuous resupply, held firm. Every crate unloaded under enemy fire symbolized the quiet victory of logistics over chaos. Then came the decisive moment, November 1942. The Japanese assembled their largest effort yet, a massive convoy carrying 7,000 troops and supplies meant to overwhelm the Marines. But American reconnaissance spotted them early. What followed was the naval battle of Guadalcanal, a ferocious 3-day clash of gunfire and explosions that turned the waters red. When the smoke cleared, Japan's fleet had suffered catastrophic losses. 2 battleships, 3 destroyers, and countless transports sunk. Most of their supplies went down with them. Onshore, Japanese soldiers waited for reinforcements that would never arrive. The U.S. supply line, battered but intact, continued to flow. By January 1943, the outcome was certain. Starvation consumed the Japanese garrison. Thousands died without ever firing a shot. The survivors called Guadalcanal Starvation Island. The Imperial Army requested evacuation. It was the first major Japanese withdrawal of the war. For the first time, the myth of invincibility was broken, not by overwhelming numbers, but by organization, persistence, and supply. Guadalcanal was not merely a victory of arms. It was proof that logistics could defeat valor. The Americans had demonstrated that industrial power, when combined with discipline and coordination, could conquer even the most determined enemy. And from the ashes of Guadalcanal, a new strategy was born: island hopping, a campaign fueled by mobility, planning, and endless supply. The Pacific War was entering a new phase, one in which entire islands would be built, fortified, and sustained overnight. Guadalcanal marked the turning point. From that moment forward, Japan was on the defensive, not just militarily, but logistically. Its empire stretched thin across thousands of islands, each one a hungry mouth it could no longer feed. In contrast, the United States had mastered movement. By 1943, the Pacific became a living organism, an industrial ecosystem pulsing with fuel, steel, and determination. Convoys followed carefully timed routes from the U.S. mainland to forward bases in Hawaii, Samoa, and the Solomons, like blood through arteries. Each island taken became another heart-pumping energy into the next assault. This was island hopping. General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz envisioned it not as a straight march, but as a sequence of leaps, bypassing heavily fortified islands, capturing those with airfields or deep-water harbors and turning them into supply hubs. The goal was not just conquest, but construction. Each victory laid the groundwork for the next, moving the front line thousands of miles closer to Japan. The scale of it was staggering. At Tarawa in November 1943, 35,000 men, hundreds of landing craft, and vast supply ships converged on a coral atoll smaller than Manhattan. In 76 hours of brutal combat, the island was taken, and within days Seabees transformed it. They bulldozed airfields, erected fuel tanks, and built docks capable of unloading a Liberty ship in less than a day. Tarawa became a launch pad for the next step, the Marshall Islands. Then came Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, and Tinian, each one a logistical masterpiece. At Saipan in mid-1944, the U.S. landed over 67,000 troops supported by nearly 500 ships. The invasion was timed to the minute, coordinated to deliver supplies faster than they could be consumed. Within 2 weeks of capture, engineers had built airstrips long enough to host B-29 superfortresses. bombers that could now strike the Japanese mainland. For the Japanese command, the pace was impossible to comprehend. Where once an island took months to fortify, the Americans could seize, build, and launch from it in days. The speed came not from luck, but from the system. Logistics refined to a science. Every crate, every gallon, every bullet was tracked and timed. Ships sailed with mathematical precision. Supply depots floated offshore like cities at sea. The Pacific Fleet had evolved into a mobile logistical empire. Huge tankers refueled fleets on the move. Repair ships fixed battle damage in mid-ocean. Hospital ships, floating dry docks, and refrigerated cargo vessels turned the Pacific into a network of industrial nodes. Admiral Nimitz's forward command at Pearl Harbor could now project and sustain entire invasions thousands of miles away. Japan's world was shrinking. Its once proud merchant fleet had been shattered by U.S. submarines. Every month, more transports sank, carrying the last of Japan's fuel and food with them. On isolated garrisons like New Britain, Truk, and Bougainville, Japanese troops watched helplessly as American bombers darkened the skies and their own supplies vanished. By 1944, entire divisions were living on half rations or less. Some resorted to foraging, others to despair. Meanwhile, American soldiers ate hot meals, wrote letters home, and received new equipment regularly. The difference was no longer morale, it was metabolism. One side was sustained, the other was starving. As the Americans advanced, logistics itself became a weapon of speed and psychology. The Japanese began to call the U.S. advance the conveyor belt, an endless line of ships, machines, and men that never seemed to stop. Each new landing came sooner than expected. Each counterattack failed before it began. Even islands bypassed by U.S. forces became prisons, cut off from resupply, left to rot in silence. The Marianas Campaign of mid-1944 sealed Japan's fate. When Saipan fell, the emperor's advisors finally admitted what Yamamoto had foreseen years earlier. Japan could not win an industrial war. From Saipan's airfields, B-29s began to take off toward Tokyo, carrying the war to Japan's own heartland. Behind every bombing raid, every invasion, and every mile gained, lay the unseen victory of logistics. The Pacific was no longer an obstacle. It had become America's highway. By 1945, the U.S. military could supply entire islands overnight. Floating depots stocked with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts moved in perfect synchronization. Engineers built airstrips on volcanic rock within days. The power of supply had become the rhythm of conquest. The Japanese soldiers who once mocked American dependence on machines now faced the silence of empty shores. Their courage remained unbroken, but their world was collapsing around them, undone by the relentless hum of industry and the endless tide of cargo ships that followed. The war's outcome was no longer in question. The empire that had risen through daring and faith was being buried by tonnage, timetables, and steel. And as the Pacific burned, the question was no longer if Japan would lose, but how long its soldiers could survive without supply. By 1945, the map of the Pacific had changed beyond recognition. The blue expanse that once connected Japan's empire now served the United States. The supply routes that had once fed Japan's advance were gone, choked off by submarines, bombers, and blockade. What began as a tactical imbalance had grown into a slow national starvation. Japan's merchant fleet, once numbering over 6 million tons of shipping, had been reduced to less than a quarter of that by the end of 1944. American submarines prowled the sea lanes, from the Philippines to the home islands, sinking tankers, transports, and cargo ships faster than Japan could replace them. By early 1945, entire convoys were being lost in a single night. Each sunken ship meant more than lost cargo. It meant the disconnection of life itself. Oil from Borneo and the Dutch East Indies no longer reached Japan's refineries. Coal from China and iron ore from Malaya disappeared beneath the waves. Factories slowed to silence, trains stalled, and even Tokyo's electricity flickered in rationed hours. But the most visible collapse occurred far from home. On the isolated islands Japan still held. On Rabaul, Truk, and Bougainville, tens of thousands of Japanese troops remained stranded. Their orders were to fight to the end, but their weapons rusted and their stomachs emptied long before the enemy arrived. With no fuel or resupply, planes could not fly and ships could not sail. Soldiers survived on coconuts, roots, or whatever they could scavenge from the jungle. Japanese reports from these garrisons tell a haunting story. Men weakened by hunger, reduced to shadows of themselves yet still drilling each morning with fading discipline. They wrote of comrades dying not from bullets but from exhaustion, malaria, or starvation. They were no longer part of a living army. They were ghosts left behind by the Empire's retreat. Meanwhile, the Americans had perfected the art of movement. From Leyte to Iwo Jima, every landing unfolded with precision. When one beachhead was secured, the next was already planned, supplied, and waiting. The Pacific had become an American assembly line of invasion. At Iwo Jima, 110,000 Marines landed, supported by an armada of 500 ships, each loaded with food, ammunition, and replacement parts. Field kitchens, hospitals, and fuel depots appeared within hours. By contrast, the Japanese defenders on the island had not received a single major resupply since late 1944. They fought to the last man, but by then, their defeat had already been decided by starvation. The Japanese High Command understood what was happening, but could not stop it. Every attempt to move supplies across open waters ended in disaster. Even small transport convoys disguised as fishing vessels were hunted down by submarines. In the air, American B-29 raids on industrial hubs like Osaka and Yokohama destroyed what little production capacity remained. By mid-1945, Japan's war economy was collapsing under its own emptiness. Factories still built weapons, but there was no fuel to test them. Pilots were trained, but had no aircraft to fly. Ships remained half-finished in dry docks because there was no steel or oil left to complete them. The empire that once laughed at American dependence on machinery had become a prisoner of its own isolation. In Tokyo, officials spoke in whispers about fighting spirit and divine winds, but the truth was no longer spiritual, it was material. Logistics had become destiny, and as the tide of war reached Japan's own shores, the world saw what it meant when an empire runs out of everything except courage. The last phase of the war would not be about who could fight harder, but who could endure the collapse of an entire system built on supply. By the spring of 1945, Japan's once mighty empire had turned into a nation of silence and smoke. The cities burned nightly under waves of B-29 bombers. The countryside starved. Trains stopped running, ships stopped sailing, and factories stood hollow. Skeletons of steel without fuel or men to power them. The loss of supply lines was no longer a military issue. It was an existential one. In March 1945, the U.S. began Operation Meeting House, the firebombing of Tokyo. In a single night, over 100,000 civilians perished, and 16 square miles of the capital vanished into flames. Yet what followed was even more devastating: the collapse of Japan's internal distribution network. Warehouses were empty, roads destroyed, railways broken. Even where food existed, it could not reach the cities. In the home islands, ordinary citizens faced the same shortages that had doomed their soldiers abroad. Rations fell to barely 1,500 calories per day. Families queued for hours for handfuls of rice or barley. In some towns, entire populations survived on tree bark, acorns, and diluted soup. Malnutrition spread, followed by disease. The government printed slogans urging sacrifice, but the spirit of endurance could not fill empty stomachs. Meanwhile, the Pacific front drew closer. The American capture of Iwo Jima in March and Okinawa in June gave the U.S. forward bases just a few hundred miles from Japan's mainland. From these islands, the logistical miracle continued. Fleets of bombers, refueled and repaired daily, launched thousands of tons of destruction across Japan. Each mission was the result of a supply system so vast it defied imagination. A single B-29 bombing run required fuel shipped from California, refined on Pacific islands and stored in massive steel drums. Each bomb casing, each fuse, each ration pack for the crew was part of a chain stretching across half the planet. It was the culmination of America's total war economy, where production, shipping, and logistics had merged into one machine. Japan, by contrast, had no machine left. Its navy lay at the bottom of the sea. Its air force flew on fumes. Even the vaunted kamikaze squadrons, symbols of last resort, were limited by fuel. In many cases, pilots trained for suicide missions but never flew. Their planes remained grounded for lack of aviation gas. By mid-1945, Japan's leaders faced the truth they had long denied. They were no longer fighting a war. They were managing starvation. Reports from the countryside spoke of mass crop failures and entire villages abandoned. The Imperial Army could not even move divisions between islands because transport ships had ceased to exist. Commanders wrote desperate telegrams asking for food, medicine, and bullets, only to receive silence in return. And yet, despite the collapse, orders remained the same: fight to the end. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, they did not strike a thriving nation at war. They struck a hollow one already dying of logistical collapse. The blasts killed instantly, but the slow death had begun years earlier, when Japan lost control of its supply lines. After Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast on August 15th, Japanese soldiers still trapped on distant islands refused to believe it. They had been isolated for so long that to them, the war still existed. Some fought on for weeks, unaware their empire had fallen. When Allied forces finally reached these outposts, they found scenes frozen in time: bunkers filled with bones, faded flags, rusted rifles, and soldiers reduced to shadows. On one island, an American officer wrote in his diary, "They fought with everything they had except food." The war that began with bold strikes and roaring aircraft ended with silence. The silence of a nation that could no longer move, feed, or fight. Japan had not been conquered solely by force of arms, but by the invisible weight of logistics, by an enemy that could move mountains of steel while Japan could not move a sack of rice. And so in the final months of the war, when the emperor spoke of enduring the unendurable, it was not only defeat he meant, it was the unbearable truth that courage alone cannot feed an army, nor sustain an empire built on isolation. The Pacific had become America's ocean, and for Japan it was now a sea of hunger, memory, and loss. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world looked upon the ruins of the Japanese Empire and saw more than defeat. It saw a lesson carved into history, that courage may win battles, but logistics wins wars. Japan had begun its conquest with faith and spirit, Yamato Damashi, the belief that willpower and sacrifice could overcome material weakness. For a time, that spirit carried them across the Pacific. But as the war lengthened, courage became a currency that could not buy oil, steel, or food. Across the ocean, the United States had turned war into an act of organization. Its factories never slept, its ships never stopped sailing. The American soldier did not fight alone. He was sustained by an invisible army of workers, engineers, and sailors who kept him fed, fueled, and supplied across thousands of miles of ocean. In the end, it was not simply a clash of armies, but a confrontation between two systems, one driven by faith, the other by supply. And when the fires of war dimmed, the truth was clear: the modern battlefield belongs to those who can sustain it. The jungles of Guadalcanal, the atolls of Tarawa, the beaches of Saipan, each had told the same story in different forms. The soldiers on both sides fought with bravery beyond words. But bravery could not replace fuel. Honor could not refill a ration tin. Japan's downfall was not born of cowardice or failure, but of the simple, merciless arithmetic of logistics. In the decades that followed, military planners around the world studied the Pacific War not only for its battles, but for its systems. The lesson was timeless. Wars are no longer won by the soldier who fires the gun, but by the nation that delivers it, loads it, and ensures it never runs empty. From the ashes of that realization rose a new era, one where strategy, technology, and logistics became the true trinity of power. And so, the soldiers who once mocked American supply learned in silence what history would remember forever: that an army marches on its stomach, but in the modern age, it also sails on its fuel, flies on its cargo, and survives on its logistics.